I want to talk about the Eastern Front of the First World War, and I want to start by telling you something that I think most people who consider themselves knowledgeable about the First World War simply do not know. The Eastern Front was larger than the Western Front. It was longer, it moved more, it consumed more men, it produced more prisoners of war than Britain, France and Germany combined, and by at least one senior German general's own admission, German losses in the East were higher than German losses in the West. The Eastern Front ran 1,200 kilometers from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. It swallowed 12 million Russian soldiers, 2 million of whom died. It destroyed the Austro-Hungarian army so thoroughly that the empire ceased to function as a coherent military entity within 18 months of the war beginning. It produced the largest single military disaster in the history of any army in the opening weeks of the conflict. And almost nobody talks about it. I think about this a lot when I read Western Front histories because the Western Front has an enormous cultural footprint. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, the Mud of Passchendaele, the Wire at the Somme, and the Eastern Front has almost none, at least in English. Part of this is a language barrier. The primary sources from the Eastern Front are in Russian, German, Ukrainian, Polish, Hungarian, Czech, Serbian, Bulgarian, and a dozen other languages. Part of it is that the Eastern Front ended not in a victory parade, but in a revolution, and the state that replaced the one that had been fighting on it had no interest in commemorating the Tsar's soldiers. Part of it is that the place names are difficult for English speakers, and the geography is vast and the campaigns are complex in ways that don't reduce to simple narratives. But the main reason, I think, is just that the Western Front got there first in the cultural consciousness, and there wasn't room. There should have been room. What happened on the Eastern Front between 1914 and 1918 was, in the aggregate, worse than almost anything that happened on the Western Front. I say this not to diminish what happened at Verdun or the Somme, which were as terrible as anything the modern world has produced. I say it because the numbers are so much larger, the scale so much greater, and the specific human experiences so much more extreme, that the Eastern Front deserves to be understood on its own terms as a catastrophe of the first order. Let me start where it starts. In the summer of 1914, Russia mobilized faster than anyone expected. This is important to understand because the entire German strategic plan, the Schlieffen Plan, that called for a rapid defeat of France in the west before turning to face Russia in the east, was built on the assumption that Russian mobilization would take at least 6 weeks. Russia's rail network was poor, its distances were vast, its administrative machinery was cumbersome, and the German General Staff had calculated that France would be defeated and the bulk of German forces transferred east before Russia could effectively intervene. This assumption was wrong. Russia mobilized in 15 days and sent 2 armies into East Prussia in August 1914, forcing Germany to respond. General Alexander Samsonov commanded the Russian Second Army. He was 55 years old, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, a man who had served his country for 3 decades. He was also, in the summer of 1914, ill. He suffered from asthma so severe that he could barely ride a horse. His command post was so far behind his forward units that reliable communication was almost impossible. The terrain through which his army was advancing, the sandy plains, pine forests and lake districts of East Prussia, was terrain his maps inadequately represented, and he was advancing simultaneously with the Russian First Army under General Pavel Rennenkampf, from whom he was separated by the 50-mile chain of the Masurian Lakes, making coordination between the 2 armies practically impossible. But the most devastating weakness of the Russian Second Army was one that nobody in the German High Command had initially dared to believe possible. The Russians were sending their operational orders by wireless radio in plain text without encryption. Every move Samsonov planned, every objective he designated, every corps he committed, was being read by German signals units as clearly as if they had been handed the original documents. The Germans knew where the Russian Second Army was going before Samsonov's own corps commanders had received their orders. The German commander, General Max von Prittwitz, had initially panicked when the scale of the Russian advance became clear, and suggested abandoning East Prussia entirely, a suggestion that produced his immediate dismissal and replacement by the recalled General Paul von Hindenburg and his Chief of Staff, Erich Ludendorff. What actually saved the German position was not Hindenburg or Ludendorff, but a relatively junior staff officer named Colonel Max Hoffmann, who had been an observer with the Japanese army during the Russo-Japanese War, and had learned 2 crucial facts. First, that Rennenkampf and Samsonov hated each other personally, the consequence of a quarrel at Mukden in 1905 that had become army legend, and second, that Russian communication security was catastrophically bad. Hoffmann proposed a plan that relied on both facts simultaneously: that Rennenkampf would not rush to Samsonov's aid even if ordered to, and that the German army could safely concentrate against the Second Army without needing to screen against the First, because the intercepted wireless traffic would tell them exactly what the First Army was doing. The Battle of Tannenberg opened on August 26, 1914. By August 30th it was over. The Russian Second Army was destroyed. 92,000 soldiers of the Russian Second Army were taken prisoner. More than 30,000 were killed. Of the approximately 150,000 men Samsonov had led into East Prussia, fewer than 10,000 made it back to Russia. It remains one of the most complete military destructions of a modern army in a single engagement in the history of warfare. On the night of August 29th, as the encirclement closed and the trap became irrefutable, Samsonov disappeared from his staff. He told his closest aide that the Tsar had trusted him with the army and he had lost it. He walked into the pine forest east of Tannenberg, away from the sounds of the still fighting remnants of his command, and shot himself with his officer's pistol. A single shot rang out of the forest in the early hours of August 30th. His body was found by the Germans days later. Hindenburg, to his credit, did not celebrate the death. He met the captured corps commanders personally and treated them with the courtesy appropriate to their rank. What he did celebrate, and what the German public celebrated with enormous enthusiasm, was the scale of the victory, and specifically the name he chose for it: Tannenberg. Not after the village near the actual battlefield, but after the site, 30 kilometers to the west, where in 1410 a Polish-Lithuanian army had destroyed the Teutonic Knights. Hindenburg was naming his victory in deliberate reversal of a 500-year-old Germanic humiliation. The prestige of the name was enormous and immediate. But I want to stay at Tannenberg a moment longer, because there are specific details about how it was fought that I think reveal something important about the Eastern Front as a whole. The Russian Second Army communicated by wireless radio because it had no other reliable means of transmitting orders across the vast distances of East Prussia at the speed the campaign required. Its communication lines were inadequate, its staff organization was under-equipped, and the sheer scale of the front it was operating on made courier communication impractically slow. The decision to use wireless was not stupid. It was the only workable option. The failure to encrypt the wireless traffic was something different. It was a failure of institutional culture, a failure to understand that the enemy had ears as well as eyes, a failure that the Japanese and British and French and German armies had all already addressed, and that the Russian army had not. The specific intercepts that decided Tannenberg were 2 wireless messages sent on consecutive days that described the intentions of both the Russian First and Second Armies in detail clear enough for the German staff to plan around them. The first message from Rennenkampf of the First Army described his intention to continue westward toward Königsberg, rather than turning south towards Samsonov. The second message from Samsonov himself described his planned route of advance in detail that included every core objective and every axis of march. When Hoffmann read these 2 messages, he understood immediately what they meant. The Germans could concentrate against Samsonov with almost no risk from Rennenkampf, and Samsonov would walk into the trap they set without knowing it was there. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, when Hoffmann presented them with the intercepts, were initially skeptical. What commander, Ludendorff asked, would be stupid enough to transmit his operational plans in the clear? Hoffmann told him that in this particular case, this particular commander would. He was right. The German encirclement was made possible by one other factor that deserves mention: the German use of railways. The German 8th Army moved its formations by rail to concentrate against Samsonov's flanks at a speed that would have been impossible on the march. The Eastern Front's enormous distances, which seemed to favour the defence, actually in this instance favoured the attacker who could use the rail network intelligently. Germany had built a dense rail network in East Prussia specifically with a 2-front war in mind. The Russians had not built an equivalent network in the territories facing East Prussia. This asymmetry in transport infrastructure shaped the first month of the war in the east in ways that were never fully overcome. After Tannenberg, Hindenburg turned on the Russian First Army. The First Battle of the Masurian Lakes, fought between September 7th and 14th, 1914, drove Rennenkampf's army back out of East Prussia. The Russian invasion of Germany was over. It had lasted approximately 3 weeks. But it had achieved one of its intended objectives. because to respond to the Russian threat, Germany had removed 2 corps from the Western Front at a critical moment, the moment when the Battle of the Marne was being decided. Those 2 corps arrived in East Prussia after the battle was over, and contributed nothing to Tannenberg. They did contribute, in their absence from France, to the German failure on the Marne that ended the possibility of a quick Western victory, and produced the stalemate that the Schlieffen Plan had been designed to prevent. Russia's disastrous invasion of East Prussia in 1914, measured by the standard of its own military success, was an almost complete failure. Measured by its indirect strategic effect on the Western Front, it may have saved France. Rennenkampf survived the catastrophe, was accused of deliberately failing to support Samsonov, the personal feud cited as the decisive factor. The evidence for deliberate sabotage is weak. The evidence for incompetence and the dysfunction of the Russian command structure in 1914 is overwhelming. He was arrested by the Bolsheviks in 1918 and shot. He was 64 years old. The historian Colonel Max Hoffmann, who had devised the plan, gave tours of the Tannenberg battlefield after the war. He would point out where Hindenburg had stayed before the battle, after the battle, and during the battle, the same location in each case. Hindenburg, he noted, had slept throughout. Before I take you to the Carpathians, I need to give you the southern half of the Eastern Front in 1914, because the war in Galicia in the autumn of 1914 was simultaneously one of the most successful Russian operations of the entire war, and one of the most devastating experiences the Austro-Hungarian army ever had, and it set up everything that followed. Galicia was the northern province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the area that is now western Ukraine and southeastern Poland, and in August 1914 it was the meeting point of the Russian Southwestern Army Group and the Austro-Hungarian armies under the overall command of Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf. Conrad attacked, Russia attacked. Both sides attacked simultaneously in slightly different directions, which produced a collision of armies across a front of hundreds of kilometers that lasted from late August to late September 1914, and consumed both armies at a rate that neither had prepared for. The Battle of Lemberg, Lviv in Ukrainian, Lwów in Polish, was the largest engagement of the Galician campaign, and one of the largest battles of the entire first year of the war on any front. The Russian armies under General Nikolai Ivanov and his subordinate Alexei Brusilov, yes, the same Brusilov who would produce the Great Offensive of 1916, drove the Austro-Hungarian forces out of their positions and captured Lemberg on September 3, 1914. By the end of September, Russian forces had advanced into the Carpathian foothills and had besieged Fortress Przemysl. The Austro-Hungarian army had suffered approximately 400,000 casualties in 6 weeks, and had lost the majority of its experienced pre-war officer corps, the men who had been trained in the peacetime professional army, and who understood how to fight. I think this point about the Austro-Hungarian officer corps deserves specific emphasis, because it is one of the most important facts about the Eastern Front that most people don't know. Austria-Hungary's pre-war army had approximately 16,000 regular officers. By the end of 1914, approximately 60% of them were dead, wounded, or captured. This loss was not recoverable in the same way that enlisted casualties were recoverable. You could draft a replacement for a dead infantryman relatively quickly and put a rifle in his hands. You could not replace the specific combination of training, experience, and authority that a professional officer embodied in months or even years. The Austro-Hungarian army of 1915 and 1916 was commanded at the critical junior and middle levels by men who were improvising their way through situations their professional predecessors had spent careers preparing for. This collapse of the officer corps had a specific human face. Lieutenant Franz Lindner of the 4th Infantry Division was a peacetime teacher from Graz, a reserve officer whose professional identity was civilian. Within 4 months of mobilization, he was commanding a company in the Galician fighting. His letters to his wife described the experience with a quality of honesty that professional officers rarely showed. I am doing what I think is right, and some of it seems to work, and some of it clearly does not work, and the men look at me as if I should know the answer, and I look back at them and try not to show that I am making this up as I go along. The ones who have been in a fight before are more help to me than any of the manuals I was given. He was killed in the Carpathian Offensive in February 1915. Now I want to take you somewhere that almost nobody goes when they talk about the Eastern Front of the First World War, and that is the Carpathian Mountains in the winter of 1914 to 1915. I came across this campaign a few years ago, and it genuinely shocked me. because the casualty figures are so extreme and the conditions are so appalling that I found it difficult to believe the Western Front campaigns I already knew so well had happened in the same war. The Carpathian Winter War has been described by military historians as the Stalingrad of the First World War. When you understand what happened there, you understand why. The fortress of Przemysl sat on the San River in Galicia, on the eastern edge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was an enormous structure, a ring of forts and fortifications several miles in diameter, built around a town of 50,000 people, designed to block the northern approaches to the Carpathian mountain passes and the Hungarian plain beyond them. The fortress had been besieged by Russian forces since October 1914. Inside it, approximately 130,000 Austro-Hungarian soldiers were trapped. Field Marshal Konrad von Hötzendorf, the Austro-Hungarian Chief of Staff, was determined to relieve it. Konrad has a specific place in the historiography of the First World War that he shares with very few others. He was a man who combined genuine tactical imagination with absolutely catastrophic operational judgment, who produced more ambitious plans in more impossible situations than almost any other senior commander of the war, and who seemed constitutionally incapable of connecting the plans he devised with the actual physical and human resources available to implement them. He planned the Carpathian offensive in the winter of 1915 without adequate warm clothing for his troops, without adequate boots. Many were marching in boots whose soles were cardboard, without adequate food supplies, without an honest assessment of what mountain warfare in winter at elevations of 3,000 to 4,000 feet in snowstorms actually required, and without, in the view of most military historians who have examined the campaign, any real understanding of why it was going to fail before it started. He launched 3 separate offensives into the Carpathians between January and April 1915. All 3 failed. The combined casualties were somewhere between 1 and 2 million soldiers on both sides. The specific figure is disputed, but the military historian Graydon Tunstall, who wrote the most comprehensive English-language account of the campaign, concluded that Austria-Hungary and Russia each lost approximately 1 million men in 3 months in the Carpathian Mountains. This is more than Britain lost in the entire Battle of the Somme. It is more than France lost at Verdun. It happened in a campaign that almost nobody in the English-speaking world has heard of. I want you to understand what fighting in the Carpathians in January 1915 actually meant, because the word conditions does not capture it. The Carpathian Range in winter is not a benign environment. The passes rise to 3,600 feet and above. The snowfall is heavy, and the drifts are deep, and the paths through the mountains are narrow enough that a column of soldiers cannot easily turn around if the direction of advance becomes suicidal. The temperatures in January drop well below freezing. The winds in the passes are strong enough to knock a man over, and Konrad was sending men into this terrain without winter clothing. The specific things that happened to those men are documented in the diaries and letters that survived, in the regimental histories, and in the after-action reports of officers who knew they were writing documents that would eventually be read by someone who needed to understand why their formations had ceased to exist. Habsburg Archduke Joseph August, commanding 7th Corps, reported to Konrad in February 1915 that his Hungarian Honvéd division had suffered terrible losses, and that its effective fighting strength had fallen to fewer than 2,000 men. And then he wrote the sentence that I find the most haunting of anything from this campaign. And tomorrow, despite the casualties, we have to attack again. Colonel Georg Veit of the Third Army wrote on March 1st, 1915, during the second offensive, fog and heavy snowfalls. We have lost all sense of direction. Entire regiments are getting lost, resulting in catastrophic losses. He was writing about regiments, not companies, not platoons, but entire regiments of 2,000 to 3,000 men, becoming so disoriented in the Carpathian snowstorms that they simply ceased to be locatable as military formations. The wounded froze to death. This is not a euphemism. Men who had been shot or had limbs shattered by artillery fragments were unable to move in the deep snow, and in the temperatures of the Carpathian winter, a man who could not move would freeze within hours. The accounts from the campaign describe being able to hear the wounded screaming in the night from positions that could not be reached. By the morning, the screaming had stopped. There are also accounts, and I find these genuinely difficult to read, of what the military reports called wolves descending on the wounded in the night. Modern historians have suggested these were feral dogs rather than wolves, but the outcome was the same. Men who had survived being shot were found in the morning, dead, partially eaten. The Austro-Hungarian Third Army suffered so many casualties in the first 2 weeks of the first offensive that official sources listed 88,900 men as casualties before the month was out. The total losses in that formation during the Carpathian campaign exceeded 75%, and the majority of those casualties were not from enemy fire. They were from frostbite, from exposure, from respiratory disease that swept through men whose immune systems had been compromised by cold and hunger and exhaustion, and from the horses. Soldiers slaughtered their own horses not in cruelty, but in desperation, because the horses were dying anyway and the men were starving, and a dead horse provided meat, and that meat kept the men alive for another day. Rifles froze solid, and had to be warmed over fires before they would function. The fires gave away positions to the enemy, the positions were attacked, the men who were too sick to run were left where they were. Fortress Przemysl, which the whole campaign was designed to relieve, surrendered on March 22, 1915, while the third offensive was still being organised. 120,000 Austro-Hungarian soldiers walked out of the fortress and into Russian captivity. They had eaten the last of the horses, they had destroyed the artillery before surrendering. They were, by the accounts of the Russian officers who received their surrender, among the most physically depleted human beings those officers had ever seen. The Russian soldier in the Carpathian campaign was not immune to the conditions that destroyed his opponents. Russian casualties in the mountains were enormous, but the Russian soldier had one specific advantage in winter conditions that the Austro-Hungarian soldier lacked. He was Russian. The specific hardiness that the Russian winter produced in men who grew up in it, the specific tolerance for cold that bodies adapted to extreme temperatures developed from childhood, the specific knowledge of how to survive in conditions that Europeans from Central Europe did not share. All of this gave the Russian infantry a marginal advantage in the Carpathians that was real, and that the Austrian regimental histories acknowledge. Private Mikhail Grigoriev kept a diary during the Carpathian campaign. He was a soldier of the 49th Infantry Division, and his diary, which survived because his sister had it when he was captured and kept it through the Revolution and the Civil War, describes the specific texture of fighting in the mountains in January 1915, in terms that no official document matches. He writes about going 4 days without hot food, about sleeping in a shallow scrape in the snow with 2 other men because there was no time and no material to build a proper position, about the specific sound of an artillery barrage on snow-covered mountain ground, different from anything he had heard on the flat plains of western Russia, the shells seeming to come from unexpected directions because of the way sound bounced off the mountain faces. He writes about a man in his section who died of pneumonia 3 days after arriving at the front, before he had fired a single shot. He writes about finding a dead Austrian soldier in a pass, sitting upright against a rock, his eyes open, and his face entirely peaceful, who had simply stopped and sat down and frozen where he sat. He writes, "I do not know if he had given up or if he simply could not continue. Perhaps it is the same thing. Now I want to take you out of the mountains and onto the flat plains of Poland, where something was happening simultaneously that I think is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of the First World War on any front. The Russian army in 1914 and early 1915 was running out of bullets. This is not a metaphor. The Russian army was literally running short of rifle ammunition and artillery shells, and the reason was one of the central industrial failures of the war. Russia's pre-war planning had calculated that a modern war would last approximately 6 months, and it had stockpiled sufficient ammunition for approximately 6 months of fighting. When the war showed no sign of ending in 6 months, the stockpiles began to run down, and Russia's domestic manufacturing capacity was insufficient to replace what was being expended. By the spring of 1915, the scale of the crisis had become catastrophic. General Anton Denikin, who would later lead the White Army in the Russian Civil War, but who in 1915 was a brigade commander on the Eastern Front, wrote about this period with a clarity of anger that his memoir has preserved across the century. He wrote, "The spring of 1915, I shall remember all my life. The retreat from Galicia was a vast tragedy for the Russian army. No cartridges, no shells, bloody fighting and difficult marches day after day. 11 days in which, with increasing roar, the German heavy artillery swept away whole lines of trenches and their defenders with them. We hardly replied. There was nothing with which we could reply. This is a general describing what it was like to command men who were being killed by artillery that they could not return fire against because they had no shells. In some sectors it was worse than Denikin describes. The accounts from the Russian infantry of this period describe a situation that is difficult to parallel anywhere in the modern military history of any major power. Men standing in their trenches without rifles, waiting for the man in front of them to be killed so they could pick up his weapon and use it. This is not an exaggeration for effect. The divisional orders of the period explicitly instruct that replacement soldiers should report without rifles and receive them from casualties. Only a part of the men at the front were armed, and the remainder waited for the deaths of their comrades. Russian corps commanders were sending urgent telegrams to army headquarters begging for ammunition. Army commanders were sending urgent telegrams to the War Ministry. The War Ministry was sending urgent telegrams to the factories. The factories were telling the War Ministry that expansion of production capacity was underway but could not deliver results for months. The men in the trenches were dying in the meantime. The German and Austro-Hungarian summer offensive of 1915, the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive launched in May, struck an army that was already in this condition. The German 11th Army under August von Mackensen opened with a 4-hour artillery bombardment of a density that the Russian positions in Galicia had never experienced, and the Russian defenders, who had neither the ammunition to reply with nor the reserves to rotate through the line, could only absorb it and wait. The breakthrough was rapid, the front gave way, and then began what is known in Russian military history as the Great Retreat. Between May and September 1915, the Russian army fell back across the entire length of the Eastern Front. Warsaw fell in August. Brest-Litovsk, the ancient fortress city on the Bug River, fell in August. Vilna, the capital of Lithuania, fell in September. The Baltic provinces were under threat. The Russian army had been pushed out of Russian Poland, out of most of Galicia, out of the western regions it had held since the beginning of the war. In 5 months, the retreat covered more ground than the entire Western Front was wide. The scale of the human disaster is almost impossible to convey. The military casualties were enormous. The historian Adam Hochschild calculated that during the 6 months of the retreat, the Russian army lost an estimated 1.4 million men, or more than 7,500 soldiers every single day. The prisoner figures were staggering. The Germans estimated they had taken 850,000 Russian prisoners during the 1915 campaign alone. But the military casualties are only part of the story, because what was happening behind the retreating army was a humanitarian catastrophe on a scale that the Western Front never produced. The Russian military command, as the armies fell back, issued orders for scorched earth. Everything that could be of use to the advancing enemy was to be destroyed. Crops were burned, bridges were blown, mills were demolished, railway lines were torn up, livestock was driven eastward or slaughtered. The problem was that these orders extended to the civilian population in ways that produced atrocities. Civilians in the path of the retreat were ordered to evacuate, driven from their homes, their houses burned behind them. The specific communities targeted with the most systematic violence were the Jews, who were accused without evidence of collaboration with the German and Austrian armies and subjected to mass expulsions enforced by Cossack cavalry. A British military attaché with the Russian army described what he saw on the roads during the retreat. He wrote, "Whole families with all their little worldly belongings piled on carts. 2 carts tied together and drawn by a single miserable horse. One family driving a cow. A poor old man and his wife each with a huge bundle of rubbish tied up in a sheet and slung on the back." He watched this stream of human displacement moving eastward for hours, he wrote, and could not find words adequate to what he was seeing. The historian Alexander Watson, in his account of the wartime experience of the Central Powers populations, describes the Jewish expulsions in terms drawn from contemporary sources. Jewish quarters were plundered and people beaten, murdered and executed. Jews were the principal victims. There were many rapes, community leaders were taken as hostages, whole communities were given hours to vacate their homes before the cavalry arrived. Those who did not move fast enough were not given the opportunity to move at all. The great stream of refugees moving east blocked the roads that the retreating army needed to use for its own movement, and the retreating army was not gentle about removing the obstacle. The civilian disaster and the military disaster fed into each other in ways that made both worse, and the combined human cost of the Great Retreat, military dead, military prisoners, civilian displaced, civilian killed, represents a level of human suffering in a single campaign that has few parallels in modern military history. Now I want to introduce you to a soldier whose story I think about whenever I consider the Eastern Front, because it captures something about the specific human experience of being in this war in a way that the casualty statistics cannot. His name was Fyodor Stepanovich Odojevsky, and he was a corporal in the 12th Siberian Rifle Regiment. He was 23 years old when the war started. He had been born in a village outside Krasnoyarsk, the son of a blacksmith, and he had 2 years of primary schooling, which made him more literate than many of his fellow soldiers. He kept a diary from the moment he arrived at the front in October 1914 until March 1916, when he was captured by Austro-Hungarian forces during a trench raid gone wrong near Tarnopol. His diary survived because when he was taken prisoner, the Austrian soldiers who searched him found the notebook, flipped through it, saw it was written in Cyrillic and therefore illegible to them, and handed it back. It remained with him through his captivity, and it survived the revolution, the civil war, and several subsequent decades in various forms of Soviet archive, until a Russian military historian found it in the 1990s. Excerpts have been published in Russian but have never, to my knowledge, been translated into English. What Odojevsky writes about most consistently in the early months is cold, not the cold of the Carpathians, which he did not experience. He fought on the northern section of the front in Poland, but the cold of Polish winter in trenches that had been dug hastily and were poorly constructed. He writes about the specific sensation of his hands being so cold that he cannot feel whether he is holding his rifle correctly. He writes about the difficulty of eating frozen bread, the standard ration, which arrived frozen solid from the field kitchens and had to be thawed against the body before it could be bitten. He writes about a friend named Vasily, who lost 2 toes to frostbite and was evacuated to a rear hospital and returned 6 weeks later. And Odojevsky writes that Vasily said the hospital was in a church and that there were so many men that the wounded lay on the stone floor of the nave and that several of them died of their injuries because there were not enough doctors. He writes about this not with horror, but with the matter-of-fact tone of a man for whom the deaths of other men have become a context rather than an event. In the spring of 1915, during the shell shortage, he writes with a different quality of feeling. He writes, "Today our artillery fired 3 shells. 3. The Germans fired all day. We counted later that the bombardment had killed 11 men in our section and wounded 23. We had nothing with which to reply. When the German infantry came forward in the evening, our rifles worked, and we stopped them, but the shells they had fired in the day had destroyed the earthworks on the left flank, and there was a gap, and the men on our right had to fall back to cover it, and in doing so left us exposed. We fell back also. We lost ground we had held since November. Then later that year, during the Great Retreat, it is August, and we are going back again. I do not know where we are going. The officers do not say or do not know. We march at night and rest in the forest during the day. There are civilians on every road, old women, children, men too old to fight. They have carts piled with everything they own, and the carts are slow, and the army cannot move as fast as it needs to when the civilians are on the road. I saw a man today who must have been 80 years old, walking alone on the verge, carrying nothing. He was going east like the rest of us. I do not know where he thought he was going. He writes about the specific psychology of retreat in a way that I find genuinely illuminating. He writes that retreating is not simply the opposite of advancing, it is a different thing entirely, a different feeling in the body and a different way of thinking. When you advance, he writes, you think about what is in front of you, the next objective, the next tree line, the next 100 yards of ground. When you retreat, you think about what is behind you, whether it is still there, whether the gap you fell back through is still open, whether the units on your flanks have already gone further back than you and left you exposed. Retreating, he writes, is like trying to walk backward through a crowded room. You cannot see where you are going, and you do not know what you are about to step on. Odojevsky was captured in March 1916 and spent the rest of the war in an Austro-Hungarian prisoner of war camp in Bohemia. He survived. He returned to Russia in 1918 and found a country in revolution. His subsequent fate is unknown. Now I want to talk about something that the casualty figures alone don't capture, which is what happened to the men who were captured on the Eastern Front rather than killed. The prisoner of war experience on the Eastern Front was different from the prisoner experience on the Western Front in ways that mattered enormously, and I think it is almost entirely unknown to most people who know the history of the war. Russia took more prisoners than any other power in the First World War. This is partly a consequence of scale, the Eastern Front was larger, and partly a consequence of the specific way that the Russian army fought, which produced large-scale surrenders in encirclement situations as at Tannenberg and later when Austro-Hungarian formations collapsed under Brusilov's offensive. By the end of the war, Russia held approximately 2 million Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war and significant numbers of German and Turkish prisoners. The conditions in which these men were held varied enormously, from camps in European Russia that were tolerable by the standards of the period, to camps in Siberia, where the mortality rate from disease and exposure was genuinely catastrophic. The Austro-Hungarian prisoners in Russia faced specific challenges that derived partly from the nature of the Russian prison camp system and partly from the character of the Austro-Hungarian army itself. The dual monarchy was a multi-ethnic empire. Austro-Hungarians were Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Slovenes, Croats, Bosnians, Romanians, Italians, and others, and the prisoners who arrived in Russian camps came from this entire range of backgrounds. The Russians, who were themselves fighting a war they had partly framed as Slavic liberation from Germanic oppression, treated the Slavic prisoners from Austria-Hungary differently from the German, Austrian, and Hungarian prisoners. Czech and Slovak prisoners in particular were sometimes treated almost as allies. There were Czech prisoner committees that organized themselves to support the Allied cause, and Czech prisoners became the nucleus of the Czech Legion that played a significant role in the Russian Civil War. A German officer named Ernst Friedrich Bosse, captured near Łódź in December 1914 and held in Russia and Siberia until 1918, described Russian imprisonment as characterized not by systematic brutality but by administrative chaos. Privations from disorganization rather than deliberate cruelty. A camp commandant told him the food allocation was inadequate and he knew it, but the problem was the supply system. Bosse wrote, "I believed him. The Russians I have encountered are not cruel people. Their system is cruel, which is a different thing." The specific human scale of prisoner experience on the Eastern Front is captured in a letter written by an Austrian corporal named Johann Schreiber from Graz, who was captured near Lemberg in August 1914 and spent nearly 4 years in a camp in the Ural Mountains. Schreiber was a watchmaker who eventually found work repairing clocks for the camp administration. In one letter, written in the winter of 1916, he describes watching the Russian guards at their routines and writes, "I watch them, and I think that they are not so different from us. They are cold, too. Their boots are poor quality. One of the young ones has a photograph he looks at sometimes when he thinks nobody is watching. We are both prisoners of the same war. He is just more comfortable in his prison than I am in mine." The Brusilov Offensive. I need to cover it here because it is the one moment on the Eastern Front where everything worked, where a Russian general applied the lessons of 2 years of catastrophic failure and produced something that deserves to stand alongside any military achievement of the war. And then I need to explain why it wasn't enough, because the story of the Eastern Front is ultimately the story of a military genius applied too late, against the backdrop of a state that was already collapsing under the weight of what the war had cost it. General Alexei Brusilov was 62 years old in June 1916. He attacked on a front of 550 kilometers simultaneously, rather than at a single point, so that the Austro-Hungarian defenders could not concentrate their reserves at the threatened sector because there was no single threatened sector. There was a threatened everything. He limited his preliminary artillery bombardment to hours rather than days, preserving surprise and conserving ammunition. He had his troops rehearse on full-scale replicas of the Austrian positions they were going to attack. He issued maps to every soldier, not just to officers. On June 4th, 1916, the Brusilov offensive began, and the results were spectacular in a way that the Eastern Front had not seen since 1914. The Austrian 4th Army on the right wing was struck by the Russian 8th Army and overwhelmed within days. The Austrian 82nd Infantry Regiment lost more than 4,500 of its 5,000 men in a matter of hours. In the first week of the offensive, Russian forces took 200,000 Austro-Hungarian prisoners, a number so large that the Austrian High Command could barely process what was happening. By the end of August, Russia had inflicted over 1 million casualties on Austria-Hungary and forced Germany to transfer divisions from the Western Front at a moment when those divisions were critically needed at Verdun and on the Somme. The Brusilov offensive was the greatest Russian military achievement of the First World War. It was also the offensive that exhausted the Russian army. The cost was approximately 500,000 Russian casualties in the first 2 months alone. The reserve formations that should have followed through the breakthroughs Brusilov had created were committed piecemeal by other commanders, using conventional methods, bogged down, and failed. The strategic exploitation that Brusilov needed to convert tactical breakthrough into decisive victory did not materialize. I want to quote what a German general wrote about the Eastern Front, because I think it captures something important about how the people who were actually there understood it. General Günther Blumentritt stated, "I will cite a little-known but significant fact. Our losses on the Eastern Front were much higher than on the Western." This is not a sentence that appears in most histories of the First World War. It should. The Eastern Front was not a secondary theatre. It was not a sideshow to the real war in France. It was, by at least one measure that matters most, the number of soldiers killed, more costly than the Western Front for the army that was fighting on both. I want to give you the German perspective on this front for a moment because I think the Eastern Front is almost always told from the Russian side in English language sources, and the German experience of it was qualitatively different from the French or British experience of the Western Front in ways that shaped German military culture for the next 30 years. The German soldier on the Eastern Front in 1914 and 1915 experienced something that the German soldier on the Western Front did not: mobility. The Eastern Front moved. It moved dramatically, covering distances that made the static mud of Flanders seem like a different kind of war, because it was. The German infantry advanced hundreds of kilometers through the summer of 1915. They captured cities. They took provinces. They fought in forests and across rivers and through villages that no German soldier had ever seen before, in a landscape so vast and so different from the Rhine Valley or the Bavarian Alps that it produced in many of them a specific combination of wonder and dread. Private Karl Reifenberg was from Stuttgart, a factory worker sent east in August 1914 rather than west. His diary from the advance through East Prussia describes the landscape with the specific eye of a man, seeing something genuinely alien. The country here is very flat and very poor. The forest is different from any forest I have seen at home. It goes on in all directions and there is no clear edge to it. I can see why people are afraid of this country. It does not give you anything to hold on to. Later, advancing into Poland, we pass through village after village that the Russians have burned before us. The old men and women who could not travel come out and watch us pass, and their expressions are not frightened, they are something else. Empty, perhaps. As if what has happened to them is too large for the normal vocabulary of feeling. Reifenberg was wounded in September 1915, sent to the Western Front on recovery, and killed at Verdun in June 1916. The specific tactical experience of the German soldier in the East was also different in another way. The Russian soldier fought differently from the French or the British, and the Germans who fought both noticed the difference. Russian soldiers, in the German accounts of this period, were described as extraordinarily tenacious in defense, willing to hold positions under artillery fire long after the tactical logic of the situation would have suggested withdrawal, and capable of absorbing casualties at a rate that would have broken Western European armies. They were also, in the German accounts, described as less consistent in attack. A German infantry officer named Captain Heinrich Berger, commanding a company in the 117th Division near Warsaw in late 1914, described a Russian infantry attack in terms that stayed with him after the war. The Russian infantry came forward, he wrote, in waves that seemed not to diminish as the forward waves were destroyed. There was a quality of determination that was different from anything he had encountered. Not courage exactly, because courage implies a conscious choice to overcome fear, but something more like acceptance. He wrote, "They are not brave in the way that Germans are brave. They are something else. I do not have the word for it. They are willing." Romania entered the war in August 1916 on the Allied side, promised Transylvania and other Austro-Hungarian territories in exchange. Within weeks of Romania's entry, Falkenhayn's German forces invaded from the west through the Transylvanian passes, while Mackensen struck from the south through Dobruja. Romania was fighting on two fronts against two highly competent German commanders, with forces it had neither the equipment nor the training to resist. Bucharest fell on December 6, 1916, less than 4 months after Romania entered the war. 2/3 of the country was occupied. The Ploiesti oil fields were destroyed by Romanian and British engineers before the German advance could reach them. Of the roughly 750,000 Romanian soldiers who fought in the war, 220,000 were dead, 150,000 were prisoners, and 200,000 more were wounded or sick. Romania's army was brave. Romanian soldiers fought hard and died in large numbers, but they were fighting in 1916 with the organization and doctrine of an army designed for the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, against an enemy that had been fighting industrialized total war for 2 years. The gap between what Romania's soldiers were capable of individually and what Romania's military was capable of institutionally was devastating. Now I want to talk about what was happening inside Russia while all of this was going on, because the military collapse of 1917 is incomprehensible without understanding the internal state of the country that was fighting the war. Russia in 1914 was a country of enormous human resources and profound institutional weakness. It had the world's largest army, which it was spending at a rate that would eventually exhaust it. It had a Tsar, Nicholas II, who was a man of genuine personal warmth and complete political incompetence, a man who understood the importance of personal loyalty and the operations of his immediate household and had no effective grasp of how a modern industrial state needed to be governed. It had a court system that produced the Rasputin phenomenon, a semi-literate Siberian mystic who had genuine influence over the royal family because of his apparent ability to control the bleeding episodes of the hemophiliac Tsarevich, and who used that influence to involve himself in military and political appointments in ways that eroded confidence in the government across every level of Russian society. It had an economy that was partially capable of mobilizing for total war and partially incapable, and the partially capable elements were being overwhelmed by the demands of the partially incapable ones. The shell crisis of 1915 was solved, eventually, through a combination of domestic industrial expansion and Allied supply. By 1916, the Russian army was better equipped than it had been in 1914, which is part of what made the Brusilov offensive possible. But the economic strain of the war was producing consequences that the military improvements could not compensate for. Food was becoming scarce in the cities. Bread prices were rising. The peasant soldiers at the front were receiving letters from their families describing conditions at home that were deteriorating. The men at the front were being told, in the letters they received, that the sacrifice they were making was not producing any visible improvement in the circumstances of the people they were making it for. The February Revolution of 1917 began as bread riots in Petrograd, the city that had been renamed from the German-sounding St. Petersburg in 1914 as a gesture of wartime nationalism, and within days had become a general strike, and then a political crisis that the regime could not manage. The Tsar's attempts to order the military to suppress the demonstrations failed when the troops refused. Nicholas II abdicated on March 2nd, 1917. He was the last Tsar of Russia. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty ended not in battle but in a railway carriage at Pskov, where the Tsar signed the abdication document and was then taken into custody by the provisional government that replaced him. The provisional government made the decision to continue the war. This decision is one of the most consequential errors in modern political history, and it was not made out of stupidity. The provisional government contained men of genuine intelligence. Alexander Kerensky was an able and committed Democrat. The decision was made from genuine commitment to the Allied cause, from fear that a separate peace would produce German territorial demands, and from the military logic that Russia's armies were still in the field. What the provisional government did not understand was that the army of 1917 was not the army of 1916. Order number 1 from the Petrograd Soviet prescribed the formation of soldiers' committees in all military units with effective authority over weapons and orders. It was intended to prevent the army from suppressing political change. What it actually did was destroy the chain of command. When officers gave orders that committees disagreed with, the committees refused to execute them. In a frontline army, this was catastrophic. By the summer of 1917, Russian units on the Eastern Front were fraternizing with German and Austrian soldiers across no man's land. Not in the informal, unofficial way that Christmas 1914 had produced on the Western Front, but systematically in large numbers with the blessing of their soldiers' committees. Men who had been shooting at each other for 2 years were meeting in the space between the trenches, sharing food, exchanging cigarettes, and agreeing informally that the war was over for them personally, regardless of what their government said. The German and Austrian command actively encouraged this. They distributed food, they sent musicians to play concerts at the wire. They understood that a Russian army that had decided to stop fighting was worth more to them than any military operation they could mount. General Brusilov, appointed Supreme Commander after the February Revolution in recognition of his achievement in 1916, launched the Kerensky Offensive in July 1917, the last Russian offensive of the war. It achieved initial success, broke through Austrian lines, captured ground. Then the Germans counterattacked with fresh divisions, and what had been a controlled advance became a rout. Russian units, rather than retreating in good order to defensible positions, simply dissolved. Men walked away from the front, not in ones and twos but in thousands, entire battalions, deciding simultaneously that the war was over and beginning the long walk home. The Kerensky offensive had cost 60,000 casualties and achieved nothing. The German counterattack had cost Russia territory that would not be recovered. Alexander Feofilaktov was a machine gun crew member in the 117th Infantry Division. He had survived Tannenberg, though not as a soldier of the Second Army. He had been in the First Army and had watched the disaster unfold at a distance that was still too close for comfort. He had survived the shell hunger of 1915, the Great Retreat, and the Brusilov Offensive, at which his division had fought in the second wave. He was 24 years old in the summer of 1917, which made him, by the standards of a Russian infantry soldier, who had been at the front since 1914, approximately as old as it was possible to get. He wrote a letter home in July 1917 during the retreat from the Kerensky Offensive that has been preserved in a Ukrainian archive and cited in several Eastern Front histories. He wrote, "We are going back again, as we always go back, except that this time I think we are not coming forward again. The men do not want to fight. I do not want to fight. Not because I'm afraid, but I've not been afraid for a long time. I do not think I have that feeling left in the normal sense, but because I cannot understand any more what I would be fighting for. Whatever it was in 1914 I was fighting for, I do not think it still exists." The Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917, the coup that Lenin's party carried out against the provisional government that had replaced the Tsar, was not primarily about the war. But the war was the condition that made it possible. The Bolsheviks promised peace, land, and bread. Of these three promises, peace was the one that the Russian soldier understood most immediately and most viscerally, because he was in the trenches and he knew what peace meant for him personally. Let me give you a specific account of what the disintegration of the Russian army in 1917 looked like from the perspective of someone who was in it, because the abstraction of political collapse tends to obscure the human texture of what was actually happening at the front. Sergeant Major Nikolai Krasnoshchikov was a career soldier from Saratov who had been in the army since 1908, and who had served on the Eastern Front from the first day of the war. He had been at Tannenberg, not in the encirclement, in a supporting formation on the northern edge of the battle, and he had survived the Carpathian campaigns, the shell hunger of 1915, the Great Retreat, and the Brusilov Offensive. By February 1917, he had 4 years of continuous frontline service, 3 decorations, 2 wounds, and a quality of exhaustion that he described in letters to his brother as something he had stopped trying to name because the language for it did not exist. His account of the February Revolution as it appeared at the front begins with rumours, soldiers telling each other that something was happening in Petrograd, that the Tsar might abdicate, that the war might end. The rumours ran through the trenches faster than any official communication, and the official communication, when it came, was confused and contradictory in a way that only confirmed what the men already suspected, that the men in charge no longer knew what they were doing. Krasnoshchikov describes what happened to discipline in his company in the weeks after the abdication as a process rather than an event. It did not happen all at once. It happened gradually, through the accumulation of small refusals and small negotiations. A soldier would refuse an order, and instead of the certain punishment that would have followed that refusal 6 months earlier, there would be a conversation. The conversation would end with a compromise, or with the order being modified, or with the officer simply giving up and moving on. Each time this happened, the company's understanding of what was now possible shifted slightly. Each small compromise made the next one easier to reach. He writes, "By April I had stopped giving direct orders and started asking requests. This is not because I had become timid. It is because I had understood that the men would do what they decided to do, and that my authority was now dependent on my ability to persuade rather than command." A sergeant major who tries to command when the soldiers know he has no means of enforcement is not a sergeant major anymore. He is just a man making noise. By July, Krasnoshchikov's company had established formal contact with the German unit opposite them, Both sides had stopped shooting during daylight hours by mutual agreement. Food was occasionally exchanged across no man's land. Krasnoshchikov writes about a specific afternoon when a German soldier walked up to the Russian wire carrying a tin of German marmalade and offered it to the nearest Russian soldier without saying anything. The Russian soldier took it, examined it, and went back to his trench. Nobody fired. He writes, "I do not know what that meant. I do not know if it meant peace or if it meant something else, but nobody shot at the German when he walked back, and the marmalade was excellent." In October, after the Bolshevik coup, Krasnoshchikov's regiment voted, not on a military question, on a political one. They voted on whether to continue fighting. The vote was conducted by the Soldiers' Committee with ballot papers and a wooden box as a ballot box. The result was 847 against continuing the war and 23 in favour. Krasnoshchikov voted against continuing. He writes, "I have been fighting for 4 years. I have lost more men than I can count. The war is not going to produce anything worth what it has cost. I voted for going home." He went home in December 1917. He walked most of the way, because the railway was overcrowded with men making the same journey. He reached Saratov in February 1918, a month before the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed. The armistice on the Eastern Front was agreed in December 1917. The formal peace treaty, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, was signed on March 3, 1918. The terms were brutal. Russia ceded Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, and parts of the Caucasus to German or German-aligned control. The treaty gave Germany control over territories containing 34% of Russia's European population, 54% of its industrial capacity, and 89% of its coalfields. Lenin accepted these terms because Russia needed peace at any price, and because the alternative, continuing a war that the Russian army was no longer capable of fighting, would destroy the Bolshevik government as surely as it had destroyed everything that preceded it. General Max Hoffmann, the German staff officer who had won Tannenberg with intercepted radio messages and given tours of the battlefield, while making dry jokes about Hindenburg, negotiated the Brest-Litovsk Treaty for the German side. He later described the scene when the Russian delegation arrived as remarkable in a specific way. The men across the table from him, he wrote, looked not like the representatives of a defeated country, but like the representatives of a country that had decided it would rather accept any terms than continue, and that this decision had given them a curious kind of freedom that the German delegation did not have. They had nothing more to lose. They signed. The Eastern Front of the First World War ended not with a German victory, but with an enormous German territorial gain that Germany never had time to consolidate, because 8 months later, Germany lost the war in the West. The territories ceded at Brest-Litovsk were required to be returned under the terms of the armistice of November 1918. Germany got nothing from the Eastern Front in the end, except the experience of fighting there and the lives it had spent, which were considerable. Russia got something different. It got a revolution, a civil war, a famine, and eventually the Soviet Union, whose founding was shaped at every level by the experience of the First World War, by the shell hunger of 1915, by the Great Retreat, by the Brusilov Offensive, by the soldiers' committees and the fraternization and the long walks home from the front in the summer of 1917. The men who built the Red Army built it specifically in response to what had destroyed the Tsarist army. The doctrine of deep battle that Tukhachevsky developed in the 1920s and 1930s was built on the lessons of Brusilov. The catastrophe of 1941, when the Red Army collapsed in the face of the German invasion, can be traced in part to what Stalin's purges did to the officer corps that had learned those lessons. And the recovery of 1942 and 1943, the eventual destruction of the German army, used the same principles that had produced the Brusilov offensive, applied at larger scale with better equipment by commanders who had survived long enough to understand them. The Eastern Front did not end in 1918. It ended in 1945, when Soviet soldiers stood in Berlin. The thread from Tannenberg to the Reichstag is long and complicated and runs through revolutions and purges and disasters on a scale that the Western Front never produced, but it is a single continuous thread, and understanding it requires starting where it starts. In the pine forests of East Prussia in August 1914, where an army was destroyed and its general walked into the dark and shot himself, and the war that followed was larger than anything the world had seen before. 2 million Russian soldiers dead, 5 million taken prisoner, more than Britain, France, and Germany combined. 9 million total casualties, 1.5 million civilians dead, 3 empires, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, and the German, that ceased to exist as a direct result of what happened on this front, the largest retreat of the war, the greatest military achievement of any general in the conflict, Brusilov's offensive of 1916, followed by the complete disintegration of the army that had produced it, and through all of it, men like Fyodor Odoevsky and Mikhail Grigoriev and Alexander Feofilakhtov, writing in their diaries and their letters home, trying to put into words something that words were not quite adequate to, describing the specific texture of a catastrophe that the history books have always been on the verge of forgetting.